Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another buddy fight video. Today I'm going to be, again, talking about revival buddies. So currently, we don't know any new information about the set, but we did get a whole bunch of new rebuddies revealed, and I think rebuddies are still doing one of three, which is technically one of four things, which is either the card's doing nothing, the card is a good update to the current deck, the card is a good build-around card, or the card is a good splash card that can go into other decks other than its own. So with all that out of the way, I want to have this be more of a weekly thing where I'm just going to talk about all of the rebuddies, but regardless, I just want to talk more about what's new information. The first one that's up is Dragon Knight El Quijote. So El Quijote, obviously, he's really good. He reduces the gauge cost of Dragon Knight monsters by 1, and then he has the Glorious Charge ability, which is when he attacks an opponent and destroys a monster or deals damage, you get a look at the top two, put one into your hand, one into your gauge. And then if you have an item equipped, the attack can't be nullified, and if it's attacking alone, the damage can't be reduced. And then he's got double attack. That's a lot to unpack in one card, but basically he's just going to be going into the new Dragon Knights deck because he's a really good card to call off of Kondo, which Kondo has a counter call ability where you could put a Dragon Knight from your hand or drop zone onto the battlefield. And I just feel like he's just going to be an extended aggression card based on that. And he's just going to fit really nicely into the current deck. So as of right now, he's definitely looking to be more of a supporting card rather than a workaround for a new deck. Now, you can experiment a little bit with him and the rebuddy Jack to try to form a interesting deck, because Gold Ritter is a Dragon Knight, so it does have a little bit of Dragon Knight synergy there. It's a bit of a stretch, but maybe something can be formed from that. Next, we have the 8th Omni Lord, Deity Lord. So he, first and foremost, is a Omni Lord. So that means you could run him as a one-of in any world but his own. In his own world, you could run as many copies as you're normally allowed. But he is trying to support the Dual Dragons deck, because Dual Dragons hasn't been around for a while, and that's what he was doing before. He's just a big soul building deck, and then you utilize the soul as a resource. So what he does more specifically is when he enters, you put 4 cards from your drop zone into his soul, and then you just can't take damage by your opponent's card effects, which that's pretty solid for a size 3 wall. And then on top of that, when this card attacks, you could remove a card from his soul into your drop zone and then deal 1 damage to your opponent, which that's okay, but he does have a lot of keywords with move, penetrate, quadruple attack, soul guard, counterattack, and a lifelink of 4. So he's just a really big size wall beater. I don't necessarily think he's that great. I don't think he's going to be splashed in much of anything, because he's definitely more of a dual dragon focused card, and dual dragons just really don't have enough tools to actually make use of him. Like, they do, but they don't have enough tools to make a good modern deck currently. So as of right now, the card is probably not going to do anything. Next, we have Center of the World, Mary Sue. What's really interesting about the new Mary Sue versus the old Mary Sue is the new one becomes a size 0, which definitely helps it become more of a solid splash card, because she just fits into a lot of formations being a size 0, and the only requirement to make her a size 0 is just having a spell in your drop zone, which that's not hard. But the big thing also about her, what makes her so good as a splash card, is her ability to basically look at the top 5 and put 2 spells among them into your hand, and then the rest on the bottom. So the old Mary Sue searched for 1 spell, this one digs for 2. While there's a little bit of utility difference between the two, the new Mary Sue is definitely looking really, really solid as a good support card, and I don't necessarily think it's going to propel Wizards as a deck forward, but it's definitely a good inclusion in the Wizard deck. So it's definitely doing more of being a solid support and a good splash card. Next, we have Giant Tanuki. So the interesting thing about Giant Tanuki is the fact that he is both Guardians and Executioners, and he plays off of both. But you could really only use one based on what flag you're using, either Guardians or Executions. He himself being both means he gets both of his abilities when he attacks, and if you have more cards that have the dual type of Guardians Executioners, then his ability continues to trigger, which his ability is really good. So his Guardian side ability is when Guardians on your field attacks, you bounce a card back to your opponent's hand, and then you put a card from your gauge into the drop zone and gain 1 life. That's pretty solid. Being able to gain a gauge and gain some life on top of bouncing a card is not too shabby. Just whenever a Guardian attacks, and then when an Executioner attacks, you destroy a card on your opponent's field, drop one of your opponent's gauge, and deal 1 damage to the opponent. The Executioner side is probably a lot better, but the fact that he can go into both worlds and he gets both of his abilities when at least he attacks works is just a really, really strong support card for either Guardians or Executioners. So he might be a good workaround card for a new Guardians or new Executioner deck. Next we have Dragon Kid Ricky, which basically the Garcat for Raging Spirits. If you have a Raging Spirit on your field, gauge and draw. Very, very simple. He also has a fake Cross Knives ability where you put this card in the soul of a size 3 Raging Spirit on your field. If this card is in the soul of the Raging Spirit, all Raging Spirit monsters on your field can't be rested, and their abilities can't be nullified, and their souls can't be dropped. So Raging Spirits is a more soul-based deck, where they want to have a whole bunch of soul, and they have a couple of interesting defensive options in the form of redirecting attacks. And what makes this card really good is the fact that there is more Raging Spirit rebuddies to play with. So there was the original Raging Spirit rebuddy, which was Burn Nova, which he's just a very, very good card. And then they also got a Japanese promo of Gang the King. So between these 3 rebuddies, I definitely think Raging Spirits could come back in some manner. I don't necessarily think that they're going to be like tier 1 competitive, but they definitely are getting a lot of good support and could possibly be a deck. But as of right now, I definitely think Ricky is a really good support card for the Raging Spirits deck. Next we have Remote Trickster Lawn Remote. He's the Traps card. He has the really good and classic effect of all traps on your field can't be destroyed, can't be bounced, and their abilities can't be nullified, which very, very typical effect for a lot of key cards now these days. And then he also has the ability Beautiful Performance, which when you cast a trap spell, you get to draw 2 cards and deal 2 damage to your opponent, and then all traps on your field get a ginormous power and defense boost and double attack. The only unfortunate thing is there's not a lot of good trap spells. Now, there are still a couple of good traps, so it puts traps in a very, very interesting position, and he definitely combos well with the old Lawn Remote because you could play the new one and then swap into the old one. And he has a whole bunch of random synergies with all of the Blazing Overclash Adventure and Dungeon Enemy cards. So there's definitely something there for him to make a new deck with based on the current stuff that's out. But I don't necessarily think that deck is going to be good. So for now, he's definitely a solid support card for what traps currently are doing. Next, we have Iceblade Joker Rebuddy, which is a pretty interesting card because when this card is dropped from your hand, you get to choose 3 monsters in your drop zone with Joker in its name. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 3 of him. It could just be 3 any Joker. And you could call them into separate areas by just paying 1 gauge when he's discarded. So that's already a pretty interesting effect. It's not very hard to dump cards into the drop zone in Legend World, so it's not like that part of the ability is super hard to get off. The more interesting part of what the card does is if your opponent or you don't have any cards in your hand, this monster cannot be destroyed and it gets +2 crit and this ability can't be nullified. The fact that he just straight up can't be destroyed even by combat is definitely really, really different and really, really powerful. Now, he could still be dropped and he could still be tucked, but the fact that he just straight up doesn't die to combat just because you or your opponent doesn't have a card in their hand is definitely something really interesting. Now, the hard part is getting to that state. So obviously he's supposed to be support for the Great Spell Ragnarok deck, but that deck is just so outdated that I don't necessarily think it's playable, and this card as a splash support doesn't necessarily seem likely because Buddy Fight is all about resource management and having a solid defense plan. Because there's just so much aggression in the game, you need to have a solid defense plan. But I don't necessarily see this card doing much of anything currently based on what we know. Next, we have First Knight of the Apocalypse Grotto, which he basically has Quadruple Buddy, without Quadruple Buddy being a keyworded mechanic. So if he's your buddy, you could put the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Knight of the Apocalypse into your buddy zone. Yes, you do get the buddy gifts for all of them when you play all of them, but what's really interesting is what the card can do. So the first key ability is all your black knights on your field get their size reduced by 1, even this card. So it allows you to run a couple of different formations in black knights, which that's pretty solid in its own right. And then he also has a really solid counteract ability where you could drop a soul from this card, and if you do, destroy all monsters on your opponent's field, and all your black knights on your field get a ginormous power, defense, crit boost, and triple attack. So he's just looking to be a very, very aggressive support card, and I definitely think he's good enough to tweak and toy and play with a new Black Knights deck, whether it's Darkness Dragon World or 100 Demons, because remember, he is a 100 Demon. So whether it's a new Black Knights deck in Parade of 100 Demons or Darkness Dragon World is to be seen, but I definitely feel like the card is strong enough to make a new deck out of, because the current Black Knights deck he kind of is a little bit awkward in, because the current Black Knights deck really isn't focused around the Knights of the Apocalypse. But that's not to say that can change, but if it does change, then I'd consider it a new deck. So he's definitely good enough to form a new deck around. 5th Fleet Satsuki for another rebuddy, and I don't know how to feel about this card, because I don't think this card is good enough to make a whole new crew troop deck around, because we already have so many other good forms of Satsuki that, like, this just feels like another form. And this is probably more of a splash card where you just occasionally would run it just because of the aggressive push that it can provide. So its counteract ability is pretty solid, where it's during each player's attack phase, you could put up to 2 crew troops from your field into its soul, and then if you put 1 or more, you could call 2 crew troops from its soul by paying their call cost, and that's kind of just really it. It just, instead of doing 1, it does 2. There are just other forms of Satsuki that are just better. And then the last card that we currently know about is Eternal Envoy Aettir. So this is the Guardians support card, and it has 2 primary effects. And I think both effects are pretty solid. So its first effect is, if your flag is Divine Guardians, you could put up to 3 cards from your drop zone to the bottom of your deck in any order, and then if you put 3 cards this way, you gain 2 life and draw a card, and then you could only use the ability once per turn. So the interesting fact is that you could do it at counter speed, so I don't know exactly what usability tools that includes in the deck, but the fact that you could do it on the opponent's turn is definitely something noteworthy. But Divine Guardians kind of already has an effect like this, so I don't exactly know how many times you're actually going to be using this effect, or how many times you are going to be using this effect. But regardless, it still seems pretty good. And then the second effect is something I'm way more interested in, which is Hyper Calling. So if 5 or less cards are in your drop zone, you can return 2 Guardians monsters from your field to your hand, then call 2 Guardians monsters with different names from your hand without paying their call cost. And then you can only use this once per turn. So this, in combination with the new Tanuki, definitely make for some really good and interesting synergies where you will go into your combat phase, you'll probably attack with Aettir, attack with something else, bounce them both, play Tanuki, play probably something else with both Guardians and Executioners, and then you can start using Tanuki's ability to gain more resources and or take away resources from your opponent. So I just think that effect is really, really solid and definitely helps the Guardians deck a lot. I don't know exactly if this is going to form a new deck. I think Tanuki is a better deck to build around with, but this is definitely a good support card for the current build, or if you want to use Tanuki as your base for a new build, I think this is still a good support if you're playing Guardians for that. So that's kind of all we currently know. I'm planning on doing this once a week just to keep the conversation going because new stuff is usually really, really hype. And I think that this is going to be a very, very special set because not only is it supporting a lot of old legacy decks, which means there's a lot of new decks to potentially build and update, but it's also just very, very unique for Bushiroad to be doing something like this. So that's kind of it for this video. Feel free to leave a comment down below. Tell me your thoughts on the current announced rebuddies or what decks you're looking forward to. Just anything you really want to talk about. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more Buddy Fight content. And I will see you in the next video.